مجدد خدمت بینندگان خوب عزیز و نازنین، همونطور که قبلا بهتون عرض کردم در این لحظه در خدمت آقای برایان هوک هستیم، مشاور سیاستگذاری وزیر امور خارجه ایالات متحده آمریکا و مسئول امور اقدام درباره ایران. Hello Mr. Hook, thank you for coming.
Hello Mr. Hook, and it's good to see you again, and thank you so much for coming to Channel 1 TV. I myself am Roxanne Ganji. We're going to ask you a few questions which were chosen by our audience.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. Is it true that the United States and the Islamic Republic agreed on backing Mr. Kazemi, the new Iraqi Prime Minister, and were there any private meetings regarding this issue?
I don't have anything to say about sensitive diplomacy that the United States conducts with Iraq. We're very pleased that the Prime Minister is now in position, and we hope that this will lead to improved security, stability, and sovereignty for the Iraqi people. I think the Iraqi people are tired of being Iran's proxy, and if the Iraqi people want to see what the future holds if Iran were to dominate Iraq, they only have to look across the border to see how the Iranian people have been brutalized, oppressed, and suffer deep corruption in Iran. And so we very much support the Prime Minister and his objectives for Iran to be a sovereign country free from Iranian interference. I think the Iraqi people have had more than enough interference from Iran.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Mr. Hook, regarding the exchange of U.S. and Iranian prisoners, has there been a final agreement, and has the Islamic Republic agreed to this agreement?
Well, we don't discuss the status of detainees through the media. I know that some in the Iranian regime sometimes do this. We prefer to conduct our diplomacy through the Swiss government. They are our protecting power. And back in November, I was able to negotiate with the Iranians through the Swiss the successful release of a U.S. citizen, Shioe Wang. And so I do think that on consular matters, that there is opportunity for the United States and Iran to work together. And we can do that in spite of the tensions that exist currently between the United States and the Iranian regime.
Okay, thank you.
And also, President Trump had asked the Islamic Republic to move their troops out of Syria. And just a few days ago, the Israeli Prime Minister, the outgoing Minister of Defense, announced that the exit of the Islamic Republic troops out of Syria. Did President Trump have an influence over this decision?
Well, which decision exactly are you referring to?
Of the troops, the Iranian troops moving out of Syria.
If you look at our policy, it has now been for a couple of years. We would like to see all troops under Iranian command and control to leave Syria. And that is a condition of the United States providing reconstruction assistance to Syria. And my colleague, U.S. Special Representative for Syria, Jim Jeffrey, has been working very closely on the ground there, doing what he can to get a political process going. I think there are increasing incentives both for President Assad and for President Putin to see Iranian troops leaving Syria, because for as long as the Iranian regime uses Syria as a forward deployed missile base to attack Israel, Israel is going to continue to defend itself against Iranian attacks emanating from Syria. And it's going to be very hard to get to a post-conflict situation while Iran is using Syria not to help the Syrian people, but to attack Israel and to create, a link to Hezbollah across Syria into Lebanon. And so Lebanon is having its own problems because of the Iranian model. We see the Iranian model under stress in a lot of different places. The Iranian regime with its own people is facing a crisis of legitimacy and credibility. The Iranian regime is facing its worst economic crisis in its 41-year history. You had 1 million people in Lebanon in October, all these different religious groups coming together and protesting against sort of the Iranian model that Hezbollah embodies of corruption and oppression and selling their country out to another country. Also in Syria, we're seeing something similar, and also in Iraq. So we see a lot of Iran's efforts to export its model backfiring.
Great.
Around 2 weeks ago, Mr. Pompeo, during an interview, called the Persian Gulf by a different name, which got objected by many of the Iranian people. Was this intentional, or was it an error on behalf of the Secretary of State?
Could you give me the first part of the question one more time?
2 weeks ago, Mr. Pompeo, in an interview called the Persian
I'm sorry,
Gulf.
this phone keeps ringing. I'm sorry about this. Sorry, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sure. Mr. Pompeo called the Persian Gulf by a different name, and many of the Iranian people objected this different name. So I wanted to know if this was if it was intentional, or was it an error on behalf of the Secretary of State?
You know, I'm not going to go beyond what the Secretary said in his comments, and so I've been focused on policy and not on geography. So I'm going to stick with policy.
But Mr. Hook, is it okay if somebody calls the Panama Canal or the Gulf of Mexico by a different name? This is a historical name that's been for centuries, and it's a legal name. It's forever the Persian Gulf, and all of a sudden, for us to name it something else, it throws a big bad message to the Iranian people. Because it's historically the Persian Gulf. It's never been the Arabian Gulf.
Yeah, this honestly is not something which that I have been tracking, but I just don't have anything to say beyond what Secretary Pompeo said.
Okay. May I then, I'm sorry, but may I just ask, as far as you're concerned, it's Persian Gulf?
Again, I'm going to leave this to the people that make maps for a living. I handle policy. My job is to focus on American national security, and that's what I'm going to keep doing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Has the appointment of the new director for the Voice of America, as suggested by President Trump, been approved yet? Because we know there was supposed to be a hearing last week at this about this issue.
You know, I don't know. The Senate, obviously, everybody's affected by COVID. I think that has probably changed the timeline on people having a hearing and getting confirmed. And
the
so I
president
think
has
in the
suggested
case
to have
of
a recess session maybe, and then get his approval that way through a recess session?
well, I don't know. That's going to be something. This is nominations are handled by the White House. VOA very much does need him to be confirmed. It is very much in need of leadership, and so we hope that the Senate will move on that so we can get leadership in place at VOA.
Okay. President Trump had recently mentioned a few times that the Islamic Republic is willing to negotiate with the United States. Is this something that's based on facts, or is this something that they haven't really approached directly yet?
Well, the United States, especially President Trump, has made clear many times that he would like to resolve our differences with Iran diplomatically. And unfortunately, the Iranian regime has not met our diplomacy with diplomacy. They often meet it with military force. That's the nature of a corrupt religious mafia that is running Tehran today. The president has now met during the last 3 years with the leader of North Korea 3 times. And the Iranian regime diplomatically never seems to miss an opportunity to avoid military escalation. We'll continue to use diplomacy. We would like to see the Iranian regime come to the table. It was about 2 years ago, a few days ago, that Secretary Pompeo gave a speech where this is after President Trump left the Iran deal, and he said that the Iranian regime faces a choice. They can either come to the table and negotiate and compromise with the United States, or they can manage economic collapse. And 2 years later, we see the consequences of the regime making the wrong decision.
Can I follow up with that? a regime that's shot down its own plane, its own ships the other day, and that people have been on the street against it. What's there to negotiate with a regime that's a gross violator of gross and systematic violator of human rights? What are we going to negotiate over?
Well, Secretary Pompeo in May made clear his 12 demands that are addressed to the Iranian regime, and that involves Iran's nuclear program, its missile program, its regional aggression, and its hostage-taking, which is a trademark of this regime for 41 years, where they use human beings as political pawns. This is what's on our negotiating agenda, and we think that our maximum economic pressure has given us the leverage that will be necessary to accomplish the deal, to make progress in these areas on a very permanent basis.
Mr. Hook, is it true that certain organizations affiliated with the U.S. government have released funding to certain political figures and institutions? And if so, can a list of those who have received these fundings, can it be publicly released for the purpose of transparency?
That question's a little vague. If you could be a little more specific, I can try to answer it.
There were certain organizations actually that were said to fund specific or certain political parties and political groups.
Like grants, we're given some grants. Are those? Is there transparency in knowing where those grants were issued to? Is there?
Are you talking about are you talking about American grants to whom?
To different organizations. Like recently, we had the disinfo issue that Tavana Group and the Farashgad Group were funded, and the funds were then withdrawn, and certain other organizations that are getting grants like that. Is there a way that there's transparency for the Iranian people, for the opposition to know who's getting those grants?
Well, in terms of the grants, specific grants, I don't have anything to comment on today. The United States does provide grants to try to help advance the objectives of the American people in our foreign policy, but I don't have anything specific to say about those grants.
Okay. And what do you say to those Iranians who are under the impression that unless the United States approves a regime change in Iran, it's not going to happen? What do you have to say to them?
Well, America's foreign policy in this administration, the future of Iran will be decided by the Iranian people. It will not be decided by the United States government. And I think if you look at the 100-year history of but I would say since the early 1900s, I think the Iranian people at various times have made a lot of progress in the direction of having a truly representative government. I think when the history book is written on the Islamic Republic of Iran, the last 41 years will be remembered as a very dark period in the history of the Iranian people's desire to have a truly representative government. And in November, when the regime had to murder 1,500 people for peacefully protesting, it says a lot about the lengths that this regime will go to advance its own ideology. And I'm sorry, I've got to do one more interview, and so I can do one more quick question, and I've got to wrap it up.
May I ask you, Mr. Hook, do you have a message for the people of Iran?
I think the Iranian people know our message very well. I've been communicating with them now for 3 years, especially over the last year and a half as I've been the U.S. Special Envoy for Iran. When you look at America's foreign policy, it is very much standing with the Iranian people. Go back to President Trump's first speech to the UN General Assembly, where he spoke directly to the Iranian people. And he said, he gave voice to the Iranian people, and he said the longest suffering victims of the Iranian regime are its own people. And every step of the way during this administration, we have stood with the Iranian people. I taped a video in front of the Iranian embassy on Massachusetts Avenue, looking forward in a very hopeful way to the day that we can return the keys of the Iranian embassy here in Washington to the Iranian people.
Great.
That's a message I still very much believe in. I think the Iranian people and the American people have so much in common. They share so many of the same values. And this regime has been a wedge between the peoples of America and the people of Iran.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much for your time.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me on. Thank you.
Thank you.